Greetings, ancestors. Welcome to another episode of The Adventures of Coyote Prophet. I'm your host, Coyote Prophet, and I thank you for joining me. This episode is promptly named The Fear. Apropos for the times that we are in, and it's been a while since I've done my last podcast, several months. And the last podcast I did was a pre-COVID-19 coronavirus podcast. And since then, as many of you all know, the world has changed tremendously in the last few months. But one thing that hasn't changed is the fear that people have inside of them about the unknown, even if that unknown is within themselves. So I'm going to share a story with you on something that happened early on in the first days of this pandemic that is happening. And it involved me and another person who shall remain nameless, who I was following and who also followed me on Instagram or IG. Definitely liked their content, liked their energy. They are an artist, a poet, also a photographer, and many other things as well. But the other thing too is that they have recently been released from incarceration and being in prison. And they had been in prison for a number of years. And so it being part of my own DNA in terms of following and listening to a good number of ex-cons or ex-offenders and watching them transform their lives and change their lives and do things differently this time around. It's enjoyable. It's really great to see people do much better and have a much more positive, upbeat attitude towards life and themselves and the world around them. Moving forward, I really started to I took a liking to this person, and so I had a conversation with myself about possibly, if ever, this is also an episode about how thoughts become things, or some thoughts become things way faster than other thoughts become things, because I spent some time thinking about this person on a level of what would it possibly be like if they were same gender loving, if they were open to a relationship. And I just played around with many different scenarios and poo-pooed it and just said, probably the best thing I'll get to experience with this person would be just to see them naked in some way, form, or fashion. Just a little joke to myself. Well, lo and behold, the next day, this person actually posted a very provocative photograph of themselves on IG. They were fully clothed. They weren't naked. This wasn't like an OnlyFans type of thing. It was them laying down, looking at the camera from their phone that they were holding in their right hand, but their left hand was firmly grasping the circumference of their private part in their pants, which you could not deny. It was very much there and very much out there, if I could just say it, like it is. So I jokingly, I laughed so hard because I was just like, I then laughed and I responded to the picture by saying, "Why?" And then I had two emoji faces, which was one crying and one laughing. And they responded by saying, "Why what?" Question mark. And my response to that was, "I will respond to you, or I will answer you in your language," which I'm assuming in my mind that he understood that when I said your language, it meant poetry, since that's what he does. So what I did was I wrote a poem. Now, I have to give you a little history. I absolutely detest poetry. I don't like it at all. And that's because of some bad experiences that I had when I was part of the poetry circuit back in the 90s here in Chicago. And it just left a really bitter, nasty taste in my mouth that still lingers today. So poetry is not a thing that I love. It's not something that I gravitate to. It's not something that flows from my loins really easily. Nah, it's just not my thing. But for some reason I was inspired. So I responded to him and I wrote this poem, and it took me 20 minutes the most. And I did it in a video, and I addressed it to him. And this is the poem, and I'll read it for you. Before the image in my mind was the desire, then the thought of a different kind of you. One that was silent yet expressive, telling stories deep from the bottomless pit of your soul's journey. Every tattoo on your heart taking bewitching physical form, especially the one in which I desire you and I to share. Hesitant, I look away, excusing yearnings from your alluring eyes, our inconceivable fate, for the fear of your renunciation keeps my solar plexus in chaos, closed and painfully craving you. Now, when I finished the video and sent it out and tagged him to watch it as well, I was kind of expecting a totally different response than what I got. Nonetheless, about less than a half an hour later, I got a response from him. And his response was, and I quote, "Yo, don't you ever contact me again," end quote. At that point, I laughed hysterically. I just fell out of my chair in just uncontrollable laughter. That was absolutely not the response I was expecting. I tell you what I was expecting. I was expecting him to respond back poetically as sort of like a challenge. And I was expecting possibly some sort of back and forth between us poetically that way, which would have been awesome, which would have been cool, and probably would have changed my whole feeling and thoughts towards poetry. You know, got rid of that nasty taste in my mouth that still lingers towards the craft. But instead, he basically took a bitch route. And what's interesting is the fact that if you are going to, present yourself in a certain way and you get a certain reaction, the last thing you should do is react towards that as if you are offended or surprised. And in my opinion, I felt that it could have been handled a lot differently. But I guess the moral of the story is that from my standpoint, there is a couple of things that really make me look at it from different angles and take into consideration that when people react in that way, when they are faced with something that they themselves fear or are reluctant to deal with within themselves, they will have a reaction that is very guttural and very visceral towards a person. And in this case, this happened to me from him through this experience. I just personally think that on some level I triggered him, and that just made him feel all the more uncomfortable. So there's a fear there, and that fear was what drove the response, what created the response, and will ultimately keep that part of himself in some sort of submerged dungeon that will only ultimately create and cause many different issues on many different levels. When you're talking about fear, fear can be a motivator, or fear can be a great destroyer. And in this pandemic sort of society that we live in at the moment, there's a great amount of fear about the future, about where we are going, how we're going to get there, what's going to happen next. Will we be able to pay our bills? Will we be able to go back to work? Will we be able to see our loved ones? Will we be able to go outside? All of these things, which are good questions, but they always end up being something that brings fear into our lives. And this experience really helped me to realize that at this particular point in time, as for me, it's always been the time to always question and look within. Go to those dark, covered places within ourselves and seek what it wants and what it needs and how it needs to express itself. Because if you don't, then it comes out in other ways, and then those ways usually end up being very detrimental. They either end up being in some sort of psychosis or some sort of physical ailment on one level or another. It could even be something that traumatizes a person to end up being in a stagnated, stuck place in their lives where they can't move forward. All they see is the past, and any ideal or opportunity to move to the future is so painfully fearful. So anyhow, I just wanted to share that particular incident and story with you about seeing fear from another in a situation where there shouldn't have been any fear at all. And right now, as this world is changing before our eyes, there's a lot of fear on many different levels, with many different people all over the globe. But it should not keep us. It should not deter us from seeking a much better and brighter future. Thank you for listening. May the ancestors be with you, and always remember, it's better to travel.